In the dim chambers of the Palazzo Vecchio, where shadows danced with the flicker of candlelight, a man sat hunched over parchments that would reshape the understanding of human nature itself. Niccolo Machiavelli, exiled from the corridors of power he once navigated with surgical precision, found himself in a peculiar position, stripped of political authority, yet possessed of insights that would outlive empires. It was here, in this enforced solitude, that he began to understand the fundamental error that transforms lions into lambs and princes into paupers. The revelation came not through philosophical meditation, but through bitter observation of his own downfall and the countless others who had preceded him into obscurity. Every relationship, he realized, was a delicate ecosystem of power, where the slightest miscalculation could shift the entire balance. Yet the mistake that changed everything was not what most believed it to be. It was not trust misplaced or loyalty betrayed, but something far more insidious and self-inflicted. The mistake was the preservation of weakness within oneself, the tender cultivation of vulnerabilities that others would inevitably discover and exploit. Like a fortress that leaves its gates unbarred while focusing on strengthening its walls, the individual who fails to eliminate his own weaknesses provides his enemies with the very weapons they need for his destruction. Machiavelli had witnessed this phenomenon countless times in the courts of Florence, where noble families rose and fell with the regularity of seasons. He had seen Francesco Soderini, once a formidable political figure, reduced to irrelevance not by external enemies but by his inability to abandon his naive faith in human goodness. He had observed how Cesare Borgia, despite his ruthless efficiency in conquest, ultimately fell because he could not eliminate his dependence on his father's papal authority, a weakness that became fatal when Pope Alexander VI died. But the pattern extended far beyond the grand theatres of political intrigue. In every merchant's shop, every family gathering, every friendship and romance, the same dynamics played out in miniature. The shopkeeper who could not bear to disappoint a customer would find himself bankrupt, his kindness exploited by those who recognized it as weakness. The father who could not discipline his children would watch them grow into adults who felt only contempt for his authority. The lover who revealed every insecurity and fear would discover that intimacy, rather than strengthening the bond, had provided the other with a detailed map of how to inflict maximum damage. The fundamental error Machiavelli understood was the belief that relationships were built on mutual vulnerability rather than mutual respect for strength. Society taught that showing weakness was noble, that confession of flaws created bonds of understanding, that this was perhaps the greatest deception ever perpetrated upon humanity. In reality, every weakness revealed was a future weapon in the hands of others. Every vulnerability exposed was a potential point of attack. Every moment of neediness was a transferal of power. Consider the case of Lorenzo de' Medici's lesser cousin, Giuliano, whose story Machiavelli had followed with particular interest. Giuliano possessed wealth, connections, and intelligence, yet he found himself consistently marginalized in family councils and business decisions. The reason was not his lack of capability, but his inability to conceal his desperate need for approval from others. In every negotiation, his hunger for acceptance was visible, and others learned to withhold that approval until he had conceded whatever they desired. His weakness had become their weapon, his need their leverage. This pattern repeated itself with mathematical precision across every stratum of society. The courtier who could not hide his ambition found himself blocked by those who used his desperation as a tool for their own advancement. The merchant who revealed his financial difficulties discovered that customers delayed payments and suppliers demanded advance settlements. The wife who confessed her fears of abandonment to her husband created a roadmap for emotional manipulation that could be employed whenever compliance was desired. Yet the solution was not to become heartless or to abandon all human connection. Machiavelli was not advocating for sociopathy but for strategic strength. The goal was not to eliminate all softness from one's character, but to ensure that this softness never became a weakness others could exploit. There was a profound difference between being kind and being weak, between being generous and being needy, between being loving and being dependent. The transformation required was both simple and monumentally difficult. It demanded the destruction of one's weak self, not through violence or harsh suppression, but through the careful cultivation of internal strength that made external validation unnecessary. The man who needed nothing from others could afford to give everything. The woman who was complete within herself could love without fear of loss. The leader who had conquered his own insecurities could inspire genuine loyalty, rather than mere compliance born of others' recognition of his desperation. Machiavelli had learned this lesson too late in his own political career. His need to be seen as indispensable had made him vulnerable to the very forces that ultimately removed him from power. His inability to conceal his intellectual pride had provided his enemies with the precise angle of attack they needed. Had he been able to eliminate these weaknesses earlier, had he been able to present a facade of disinterested competence rather than eager brilliance, he might have navigated the political upheavals that destroyed his career. But it was not merely about facades or deception. The destruction of weakness required genuine internal transformation. One could not simply pretend to be strong while remaining internally fragile. Others possessed an uncanny ability to detect the difference between authentic power and its mere performance. The pretense of strength, when built upon foundations of actual weakness, crumbled under pressure precisely when it was most needed. The process began with recognition. Most individuals were so accustomed to their weaknesses that they had become invisible to their owners. The need for approval felt like politeness. The fear of confrontation masqueraded as peacemaking. The inability to say no presented itself as generosity. But each of these seemingly virtuous behaviors created points of leverage that others would inevitably discover and exploit. Machiavelli remembered a particular incident from his diplomatic missions to France, where he had observed the Duke of Valentinois, Cesare Borgia, in action. During negotiations with French officials, Borgia had maintained perfect composure even when discussions turned to matters he clearly cared deeply about. When the French ambassador attempted to manipulate him by threatening to withdraw support for his military campaigns, Borgia had simply nodded and begun discussing alternative arrangements. His apparent indifference to the outcome had immediately shifted the power dynamic, forcing the French to reconsider their position. They needed his cooperation more than he needed their approval. This was the essence of what Machiavelli came to understand as the destruction of weakness. It was not the elimination of desires or attachments, but the elimination of dependency upon others for the satisfaction of those desires. Borgia wanted French support, but he had prepared himself internally to succeed without it. This preparation, both practical and psychological, had transformed what could have been a weakness into a source of strength. The same principle applied in every sphere of human interaction. The merchant who had diversified his customer base could afford to refuse unreasonable demands from any single client. The parent who had cultivated self-respect independent of their children's behavior could discipline effectively without fear of losing love. The spouse who maintained individual interests and friendships could love without possessiveness, knowing that their happiness did not depend entirely upon their partner's presence or approval. Yet the transformation was not without its costs. The destruction of weakness often required the abandonment of comfortable patterns and familiar roles. The person accustomed to receiving sympathy and assistance by displaying vulnerability would need to learn new ways of connecting with others. The individual who had always motivated others through their own neediness would have to develop more sophisticated leadership skills. The friend who had maintained relationships through constant availability would need to establish boundaries that might initially seem harsh or distant. Machiavelli understood that this process would be particularly challenging in intimate relationships, where vulnerability was often confused with love itself. But he had observed that the strongest marriages were those where neither partner needed the other for their fundamental sense of worth and identity. When both individuals were complete within themselves, their choice to be together became a celebration rather than a desperate necessity. Their love became a gift rather than a demand. The political implications were equally profound. A leader who needed approval from his subjects would inevitably compromise his principles to maintain popularity, gradually eroding the very qualities that had made him worthy of leadership in the first place. But a leader who had eliminated his need for approval could make decisions based purely on merit and necessity, earning genuine respect even when his choices were unpopular in the moment. This did not mean becoming isolated or indifferent to others' opinions. Rather, it meant distinguishing between valuable feedback and mere social pressure, between wise counsel and emotional manipulation. The strong individual could listen to criticism without being crushed by it, could consider alternative perspectives without being swayed by irrelevant factors like the critic's approval or disapproval of him personally. As Machiavelli reflected on these principles in his exile, he began to see how they might be systematically applied to transform not just individual relationships but entire social structures. A society composed of strong individuals, those who had destroyed their weak selves, would function fundamentally differently from one built upon mutual dependency and weakness. Such a society would be more honest, more efficient, and ultimately more humane, because its members would interact from positions of choice rather than desperate need. Part 2. The Mechanics of Transformation. The dawn light filtering through the narrow windows of Machiavelli's study revealed pages upon pages of observations, each one a fragment of understanding about the great transformation he had come to believe was possible. Having identified the fundamental mistake that altered relationship dynamics, he now turned his attention to the practical mechanics of change. How does one actually destroy weakness without destroying oneself? How does one maintain human connection while eliminating the vulnerabilities that others inevitably exploit? The answer, he realized, lay not in a single dramatic gesture, but in a systematic process of internal architecture. Like the construction of a fortress, the building of invulnerable strength required careful planning, quality materials, and patient execution. But unlike a fortress which was built to keep others out, this construction was designed to make external attacks irrelevant rather than impossible. The first principle was the cultivation of optionality. Every weakness, Machiavelli observed, stemmed from a lack of alternatives. The merchant who depended on a single customer for the majority of his income would inevitably find himself at that customer's mercy. The lover who had no life outside of romance would be vulnerable to every mood and whim of their beloved. The courtier whose entire identity rested upon his position at court would sacrifice any principle to maintain that position. But optionality was not merely about having backup plans, it was about developing the internal resources that made external circumstances largely irrelevant to one's fundamental well-being. Machiavelli had witnessed this principle embodied in the person of Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness of Mantua, whose political acumen had allowed her small city-state to navigate the treacherous waters of Italian politics, while much larger powers fell to conquest or internal strife. Isabella's strength lay not in her military might or vast wealth, but in her systematic development of multiple sources of value and influence. She was a patron of the arts, a skilled diplomat, a shrewd military strategist, and a cultural innovator. This diversification meant that no single relationship or circumstance could destroy her power. When military threats emerged, she could rely on diplomatic alliances. When political pressures mounted, she could leverage her cultural influence. When economic challenges arose, she could activate her network of artistic and intellectual connections. More importantly, Isabella had cultivated internal resources that made her independent of external validation. Her sense of worth was not tied to others' opinions, but to her own assessment of her actions and achievements. This internal foundation allowed her to make decisions based on long-term strategic considerations rather than short-term emotional needs. When the Pope demanded tribute, she could calculate the true costs and benefits rather than being paralyzed by fear of ecclesiastical disapproval. When French armies threatened her borders, she could negotiate from a position of internal calm rather than desperate panic. The same principle applied to more personal relationships. Machiavelli recalled a conversation with his friend Francesco Vettori about a mutual acquaintance whose marriage had transformed from a source of joy into a mechanism of mutual torture. The husband, initially attracted to his wife's apparent need for his protection and guidance, had gradually found himself trapped by that same neediness. Every decision required extensive negotiation. Every social engagement became a source of anxiety about her reactions. Every moment of independence was met with accusations of abandonment. The wife, for her part, had discovered that her husband's initial attentiveness was motivated not by genuine care, but by his own need to be needed. As she grew more comfortable and confident in the marriage, expressing her own opinions and desires, he became increasingly threatened and controlling. Neither had developed the internal resources necessary to love without dependency, to care without possessiveness, to commit without the fear that commitment meant the death of individual identity. The solution, Machiavelli understood, required both partners to destroy their weak selves simultaneously, but this was precisely what made it so difficult to achieve. Weakness seeks weakness. It gravitates toward relationships that confirm and enable its patterns. The needy person attracts others who need to be needed, creating what appeared to be complementary but was actually a mutually destructive dynamic. Breaking this pattern required what Machiavelli termed strategic solitude, periods of deliberate isolation designed not to escape human connection, but to develop the internal resources that would make future connections more authentic and less vulnerable. During these periods, the individual would work to identify and eliminate the specific needs that made them susceptible to manipulation and control. The process began with brutal honesty about one's actual motivations. Most people, Machiavelli observed, told themselves elaborate stories about their noble intentions while remaining blind to the underlying weaknesses that drove their behavior. The parent who claimed to sacrifice everything for their children's welfare was often actually sacrificing their children's development to satisfy their own need to feel indispensable. The friend who is always available to help others was frequently using this availability to avoid confronting their own problems and pursuing their own goals. This self-examination required a kind of internal auditing that most individuals found deeply uncomfortable. It meant acknowledging that many of their seemingly virtuous behaviors were actually sophisticated forms of weakness, that their generosity might be desperate attempts to purchase approval, that their loyalty might be fear of abandonment disguised as nobility. Machiavelli had performed this audit on himself during his exile, forced by circumstances to confront the motivations that had driven his political career. He discovered that his brilliant analytical abilities, which he had always considered his greatest strength, were often employed in service of his need to be recognized as indispensable to his superiors. His famous reports and recommendations were not purely objective analyses but carefully crafted performances designed to maintain his position and influence. This recognition was initially devastating but ultimately liberating. Once he understood his own patterns, he could begin to modify them. He could continue to write brilliant analyses, but now, from a position of internal security rather than desperate need for validation, the quality of his work improved because it was no longer contorted by his anxiety about how it would be received. The second principle was the development of what Machiavelli called principled flexibility. This was the ability to adapt one's methods while remaining anchored to core values that were not negotiable. Weak individuals tended toward one of two extremes: either rigid inflexibility that made them brittle and easily broken, or spineless adaptability that made them shapeless and ultimately useless. The strong individual navigated between these extremes by developing a clear hierarchy of values. Certain principles were absolute and could not be compromised under any circumstances. These formed the unshakable foundation of character. Other preferences and positions were tactical and could be adjusted based on circumstances without compromising fundamental integrity. Cesare Borgia had exemplified this principle during his military campaigns. His strategic goal of unifying Italy under effective leadership was non-negotiable, but his methods varied dramatically based on circumstances. When diplomacy served his purposes, he was an accomplished diplomat. When military force was required, he was ruthlessly efficient. When deception was necessary, he employed it without hesitation. This flexibility made him unpredictable to enemies while maintaining consistency of ultimate purpose. The same approach could be applied to personal relationships. The individual who had identified their core values and needs could afford to be flexible about how those needs were met. The person whose fundamental requirement was intellectual stimulation could find this in various relationships and activities, making them less dependent on any particular source. The individual whose core value was creative expression could pursue this through multiple channels, reducing their vulnerability to criticism or rejection in any single area. This principled flexibility also applied to emotional responses. The weak individual was typically at the mercy of their immediate emotional reactions, creating predictable patterns that others could exploit. The person who always became angry when criticized, who invariably felt guilty when others expressed disappointment, who consistently responded to pressure with either aggressive resistance or complete capitulation, had essentially provided others with a manual for their manipulation. The strong individual developed what Machiavelli termed emotional optionality, the ability to choose their responses based on strategic considerations rather than automatic patterns. This did not mean becoming emotionally dead or calculating in some sociopathic sense, but rather developing the internal space necessary to consider options before reacting. This skill was particularly crucial in conflict situations. The weak individual typically responded to conflict with fight, flight, or freeze responses that were largely automatic and therefore predictable. But the strong individual could assess each conflict situation independently, choosing the response most likely to serve their long-term interests while remaining consistent with their core values. Sometimes the most powerful response to criticism was acknowledgement and gratitude. Sometimes it was complete indifference. Sometimes it was counterattack. The key was that the response was chosen rather than automatic, strategic rather than merely reactive. Machiavelli had observed this principle in action during his diplomatic missions to France, where he had watched Cardinal Georges d'Amboise navigate the complex political pressures of the French court. When accused of incompetence by rival courtiers, the cardinal sometimes responded with detailed explanations of his actions, sometimes with humor that deflected the attack, and sometimes with silence that suggested the accusations were beneath his notice. His responses were so varied and context-dependent that potential attackers could never predict how he would react, making them hesitant to attack in the first place. The third principle was the systematic development of internal sources of validation and meaning. This was perhaps the most crucial aspect of destroying weakness, because external dependency for self-worth was the root from which all other vulnerabilities grew. Most individuals, Machiavelli observed, had never learned to validate themselves effectively. They knew intellectually that they should not depend on others for their sense of worth, but they had never developed the practical skills necessary to generate genuine self-respect and satisfaction. They were like merchants who understood the importance of diversification, but had never learned how to identify and develop new markets. The development of internal validation required what Machiavelli called private victories, achievements and experiences that generated genuine satisfaction independent of external recognition. These might be creative projects pursued purely for personal fulfillment, physical challenges undertaken for the sake of self-testing, intellectual pursuits followed out of curiosity rather than professional necessity, or spiritual practices that connected the individual to sources of meaning larger than social approval. The key was that these private victories had to be genuinely private, not simply public achievements that happened to receive little attention, but accomplishments that would be satisfying even if no one else ever knew about them. This distinction was crucial because achievements that were secretly designed to impress others, even if that impression was delayed or indirect, still created external dependency. Machiavelli had discovered this principle through his own writing during exile. Initially, his historical and political analyses were motivated largely by his hope that they would eventually restore him to political favor. But as years passed and restoration became increasingly unlikely, he found himself continuing to write for the sheer satisfaction of understanding and expressing complex ideas. This transition from external to internal motivation had paradoxically made his work more powerful and influential than anything he had produced while in office. The cultivation of private victories served multiple purposes. First, it provided alternative sources of satisfaction that made external approval less necessary. Second, it developed skills and knowledge that increased actual competence and value. Third, it created internal experiences of mastery that built genuine confidence rather than the brittle pseudo-confidence that came from others' opinions. But perhaps most importantly, private victories taught individuals how to be alone with themselves without discomfort. This capacity for solitude was essential for destroying weakness, because weakness thrived on distraction from internal emptiness. The person who could not bear to be alone with their own thoughts would inevitably seek external stimulation and validation, creating multiple opportunities for dependency and manipulation. Part 3. The invulnerable individual and the new social order. As Machiavelli contemplated the final implications of his theory, the candles in his study had burned low, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the weight of revelation. He had identified the fatal mistake that transformed relationships from sources of mutual enrichment into mechanisms of mutual exploitation. He had outlined the systematic process by which individuals could destroy their weak selves without destroying their capacity for human connection. Now he faced the most profound question of all: what kind of society would emerge if these principles were widely understood and applied? The answer, he realized, would fundamentally challenge every existing assumption about human relationships and social organization. A world populated by individuals who had destroyed their weak selves would operate according to entirely different principles than the current order, which was built upon the systematic exploitation of mutual weakness and dependency. In the existing system, Machiavelli observed, most social institutions functioned as elaborate mechanisms for managing and channeling human weakness rather than eliminating it. Religion promised salvation to those who confessed their inadequacy. Government offered protection to those who acknowledged their inability to protect themselves. Commerce thrived on creating artificial needs that could be satisfied through external consumption. Even education focused more on identifying and correcting deficiencies than on developing inherent strengths and capabilities. These institutions were not necessarily malevolent in their intentions, but they created systematic incentives for individuals to remain in states of managed weakness rather than developing genuine strength. The religious person who achieved genuine spiritual strength would no longer need institutional mediation between themselves and the divine. The citizen who developed genuine capabilities for self-governance would require less governmental supervision and control. The individual who learned to generate satisfaction internally would consume less and produce more. But a society of genuinely strong individuals would not collapse into chaos or selfishness as some might fear. Quite the contrary. Such a society would be more stable, more productive, and ultimately more humane than one built upon managed weakness. The reason was that strength, unlike weakness, did not require the exploitation of others for its maintenance. Weak individuals were necessarily parasitic in their relationships. The person who needed approval would manipulate others to provide it. The individual who required emotional validation would create elaborate dramas to generate it. The one who depended on others for their sense of identity would resist any change or growth that threatened their dependent relationships. Weakness created zero-sum dynamics, where one person's gain required another's loss. But strength was inherently generative. The person who had eliminated their need for external validation could give approval freely without depleting themselves. The individual who had developed internal sources of meaning could contribute to others' growth without fear that others' strength would diminish their own position. The one who was complete within themselves could love without possessiveness, lead without domination, and collaborate without hidden agendas. Machiavelli had witnessed glimpses of this possibility in certain exceptional relationships and communities. He remembered the workshop of Leonardo da Vinci, where he had observed interactions between individuals who were each so absorbed in their own mastery and creation that they supported each other's work without the jealousy and competition that typically characterized artistic communities. Each person's achievement enhanced rather than threatened the others because their primary satisfaction came from the work itself rather than from relative status or recognition. Similarly, he had observed certain military units where the soldiers' discipline and training had eliminated the fears and insecurities that typically created friction in group situations. These units operated with an efficiency and mutual support that seemed almost supernatural to those accustomed to the usual dynamics of human cooperation. The men trusted each other completely not because they were naturally noble, but because each individual had developed the internal resources necessary to function effectively regardless of others' actions. The political implications of such a transformation would be revolutionary. Current governmental systems were designed to manage populations of weak individuals who required external control and direction. Laws existed primarily to prevent the destructive behaviors that emerged from unchecked weakness: theft born of neediness, violence born of insecurity, corruption born of desperate ambition. But a population of strong individuals would require fundamentally different governmental structures. Laws would focus more on coordination and optimization than on prevention and punishment. Leaders would be chosen for their competence and vision rather than their ability to promise security to the insecure and validation to the needy. Political discourse would center on practical questions of social organization, rather than emotional appeals to group identity and victimhood. Machiavelli envisioned political debates, where participants argued from positions of genuine principle rather than calculated self-interest disguised as principle. Representatives who had destroyed their weak selves would not need to maintain power for ego gratification or financial security, making them capable of genuine statesmanship. Citizens who were internally complete would make decisions based on long-term consequences rather than immediate emotional satisfaction. The economic implications were equally profound. Current economic systems were largely based on the creation and satisfaction of artificial needs that kept individuals in states of perpetual dissatisfaction and consumption. Marketing functioned by identifying insecurities and promising that specific purchases would resolve them. Credit systems enabled people to spend money they didn't have on things they didn't need, to impress people whose opinions shouldn't matter to them. But strong individuals would consume more thoughtfully and produce more creatively. Their purchases would be based on actual utility rather than status anxiety or emotional comfort seeking. Their work would be motivated by mastery and contribution, rather than desperate financial need or status competition. The economy would become more efficient as resources flowed toward actual value creation rather than the satisfaction of neurotic compulsions. Perhaps most importantly, strong individuals would form stronger families and communities. Current relationship patterns were often based on complementary weaknesses rather than mutual strength. People partnered with those who needed what they could provide and who could provide what they needed, creating relationships that were fundamentally transactional rather than truly intimate. Children growing up in families of strong individuals would learn strength by example rather than weakness through overprotection or neglect. They would develop internal resources early rather than learning to manipulate others to meet their needs. Education would focus on developing capabilities rather than managing deficiencies. Community organizations would function as collections of strong individuals choosing to collaborate rather than as therapy groups for managing collective weakness. Religious institutions would focus on developing spiritual strength rather than managing spiritual neediness. Social movements would be motivated by vision and principle, rather than resentment and victimhood. Yet Machiavelli also recognized the challenges such a transformation would face. Existing power structures had vested interests in maintaining populations of managed weakness. Institutions built on dependency would resist changes that might make their services less necessary. Individuals who had learned to derive advantage from others' weakness would oppose the spread of strength. Moreover, the transformation could not be imposed from outside. Strength could only be developed individually, through the personal choice to destroy one's weak self. No government program or social movement could force individuals to become strong, because the essence of strength was precisely the elimination of external dependency. The change would need to spread through example and education rather than coercion. Individuals who had successfully destroyed their weak selves would need to demonstrate the benefits of such transformation, not through preaching, but through the quality of their relationships and the effectiveness of their actions. Children would need to observe strength in their parents and teachers. Young adults would need to encounter mentors who embodied these principles. Machiavelli also understood that the transition would be gradual and uneven. Some individuals were more ready than others to undertake the difficult process of destroying their weak selves. Some communities and cultures were more supportive of such development than others. The transformation would likely begin in certain segments of society and spread slowly, creating temporary tensions between those operating from strength and those still functioning from weakness. But ultimately, Machiavelli believed the advantages of strength were so apparent and so practical that the transformation was inevitable. Strong individuals were simply more effective in every area of life. They made better friends, partners, parents, workers, leaders, and citizens. Their relationships were more satisfying, their work more productive, their lives more meaningful. As he set down his pen in the early hours of dawn, Machiavelli reflected on the paradox that had emerged from his analysis. The path to invulnerability required not the hardening of the heart, but its strengthening. The destruction of weakness led not to isolation, but to genuine intimacy. The elimination of dependency created not selfishness, but generosity. The man who had destroyed his weak self could never be destroyed by others, not because he was impervious to attack, but because he had eliminated the internal vulnerabilities that made external attacks effective. He had built his identity on foundations that others could not shake, developed resources that others could not deplete, and cultivated satisfaction that others could not threaten. Such a man could afford to love deeply because he did not love from neediness. He could lead effectively because he did not lead from insecurity. He could contribute generously because he did not give from emptiness. He could engage fully with life because he did not depend on life for his sense of worth. In the end, Machiavelli realized the greatest political insight was also the most personal one. The individual who had conquered himself had no need to conquer others, and therefore was capable of relationships and social structures based on choice rather than force, strength rather than weakness, love rather than fear. This was the true meaning of power. Not the ability to control others through their weaknesses, but the ability to remain uncontrolled through the elimination of one's own vulnerabilities. It was a power that grew through sharing rather than hoarding, that strengthened through connection rather than isolation, that endured through principle rather than force. The document that had begun as an analysis of relationship dynamics had become a blueprint for human transformation. The recognition of the one mistake that changed relationship power had revealed the path to a fundamentally different way of being human, one that honored both the individual's need for autonomy and the species' requirement for cooperation. As the first light of dawn illuminated the pages of his work, Machiavelli understood that he had discovered something more valuable than political power or social position. He had found the secret to genuine freedom, the systematic destruction of everything within oneself that could be used as a weapon against oneself. It was a freedom that could never be granted by others and could never be taken away by others because it existed entirely within the domain of individual choice and commitment. The man who destroyed his weak self could never be destroyed by others because he had become, in the deepest sense, indestructible, not through the hardness of stone, but through the flexibility of water, not through the isolation of the mountain peak, but through the centeredness of the deep well, not through the conquest of the world, but through the mastery of himself. This was Machiavelli's final gift to humanity, not instructions for the manipulation of others, but a roadmap for the liberation of oneself. In a world built on the exploitation of mutual weakness, He had discovered the principles for building a new world based on mutual strength. It was a discovery that would change everything for those with the courage to apply it.